This lesson will be about processing speed. We'll review what processing speed is, some of the biological bases of the domain, as well as processing speed dysfunction and measurement issues in neuropsychology. Broadly, processing speed is the ability to process simple information quickly and efficiently. Processing speed underlies many other cognitive domains, so it's an important area of cognition to make sure we're considering in the context of neuropsychological assessments. Like with any cognitive domain, there's natural variation between individuals. So two people without processing speed dysfunction won't necessarily perform identically on tests measuring processing speed, and two people with processing speed dysfunction also won't necessarily perform identically to one another. There are three major types of processing speed. Verbal processing speed is the efficiency with which an individual can process and respond to auditory or verbal information. Visual processing speed is the speed at which one interprets and responds to visual stimuli or information. And motor processing speed is the rate at which an individual can initiate and execute motor actions in response to a stimulus. And an individual with processing speed dysfunction may show deficits on 1, 2, or all of these. Why is processing speed important? Processing speed underlies many day-to-day activities that we engage in. Decision-making, for example, the speed at which our brain processes information influences how efficiently and how effectively we can react to stimuli, make decisions, and engage in day-to-day tasks. Consider driving, for example, and other situations where it's important to be able to act quickly in order to keep yourself and others safe. Social interactions. Conversations and social interactions require us to interpret both verbal and nonverbal cues. Faster processing helps you understand these cues in real time, leading to smoother and more effective communication. Learning. Right now, you're processing what I'm saying and what you're reading. That's an important step in eventually learning that information and being able to remember it later. These are only some examples of the ways in which you rely on processing speed in your day-to-day life, but there are also other areas of your life, as well as other cognitive domains that I'll discuss in a bit, that also rely on processing speed. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the biological bases, or some of the biological bases, of processing speed. Neurons are the fundamental units of the brain and nervous system, and they're responsible for receiving, processing, and transmitting information. The ability of these neurons to do this quickly and efficiently allows for better processing speed via effective communication within the central nervous system. To the right here, you can see an example drawing of one such neuron. Myelination is also an important component of processing speed. Myelin is the protective sheath around the axon of the neuron. More myelination leads to faster and more efficient transmission of neural impulses, which again allows for more effective communication within the central nervous system. Demyelinating diseases, like multiple sclerosis, which attack this myelin sheath, makes transmission less efficient and in turn can impact an individual's processing speed. Neurotransmitters are also an important component of processing speed. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that transmit signals from one neuron to another. The presence of these neurotransmitters and their quantity can impact how efficiently neurons communicate. You can see this minimalist image here to the right. You can see the presynaptic neuron, which is the neuron sending a signal, sending out these neurotransmitters in blue. The postsynaptic neuron, which is receiving the signal, has specialized receptors here, which allows it to take in the neurotransmitters. If there were no neurotransmitters or too few present, this communication would either be slowed or the signal would not be received at all. This can also be disrupted in a couple of other ways. For example, if these receptors were not present or if they were blocked, that would also lead to a disruption in communication. One other primary biological basis, although this is not an exhaustive list, is connectivity within the central nervous system. I have a simplified example here to the right. Imagine that each of these circles is a small region of the brain, and each of these lines represents a communication pathway. If it helps, you can imagine these little circles as cities and these pathways as highways. Right now, some areas have to go through other areas in order to communicate. So for this region to communicate here, it needs to go through this region here. But now let's say that there's a disruption. Now, in order for this area to communicate with this area, it needs to take an extra path in order to do so. When you have these sorts of disruptions, you slow down communication, which directly impacts your processing speed. There are a number of factors that influence processing speed through the mechanisms that we've just discussed. As individuals age, they experience cell death in the brain. Poor cardiovascular health can also lead to widespread damage. Certain genetic factors are associated with a greater likelihood of developing diseases that impact the brain and can also be associated with slower processing speed. And disease processes and injury themselves are also directly linked through those biological processes we've just discussed. Now let's talk a little bit about processing speed dysfunction. It's important to note that while processing speed impacts so many areas of daily functioning, processing speed itself doesn't equate necessarily to a lack of intelligence or capability. Dysfunction is associated with difficulty, but we can often accommodate some of these challenges that individuals face. Some challenges might be slower reaction times, taking a longer time to complete tasks, having difficulty carrying conversations, and difficulty driving or performing other important daily activities. There are also a number of conditions associated with processing speed dysfunction. In some of these, processing speed may be the primary area of cognition impacted, but in others, like Alzheimer's disease, for example, processing speed dysfunction comes along with dysfunction in other areas typically as well. Other areas are reversible. So, for example, processing speed difficulties in depression can remit when depression is treated. In multiple sclerosis, the primary cause of this is demyelination. In traumatic brain injury, you typically have disruption of neural networks and that connectivity we talked about. In diseases that are neurodegenerative, such as Alzheimer's disease, damage to brain cells disrupts the connectivity as well. In Parkinson's disease, loss of dopamine, which is one particular neurotransmitter, leads to changes in processing speed, especially motor. You'll review these other domains as part of some of these lectures, but it's important to note that poor processing speed can impact other areas of cognition as well. For example, learning. If you can't properly attend to and process information, then you'll struggle to effectively learn that information, which in turn will impact your ability to recall that information. So even people with a relatively unimpaired memory, in that they can recall what they do learn, might perceive that they're experiencing issues with their memory when they're actually experiencing processing speed difficulties. The same goes for executive functioning and social cognition. As we mentioned earlier, for example, conversations often involve processing verbal and nonverbal cues very quickly for an extended period of time. Even if someone can understand these cues, slowed processing speed impacts their ability to quickly and effectively respond to them despite otherwise intact social cognition or executive functioning ability. We're going to end this lecture on the limitations of our processing speed measures. Although we have measures that are able to approximate processing speed, we do have to be attentive to a few considerations. As we talked about in the last slide, we should be mindful of how processing speed relates to other cognitive domains and the overlap between neuropsychological measures. Processing speed tests may also be written or verbal, which may be impacted by disease processes that are simultaneously impacting processing speed or by completely unrelated means. For example, someone may have been in a car accident and received a head injury as a result, and they may have also broken their dominant hand in the same accident. If we gave them a written test and they couldn't complete it, it wouldn't be appropriate to conclude that they have motor processing speed deficits, would it? Language and cultural barriers are also important to consider throughout our testing. Even in a simple task, we need to ask if there are language components or cultural components, either in the instructions or in how an individual completes it, that might be influencing the results we're seeing. We also need to ask if an individual is attending to the information. Are they not giving full attention, or are they? And if they're not, is it because they're exhausted, or they're unable to for a clinical reason, or are they not giving it their all? Ultimately, our processing speed measures, as with any of our measures, have limitations that we need to be mindful of. And this concludes our overview of processing speed.